I'm going to demonstrate how to install your placket so that we can then take a look at your placket placement, confirm that, and then you can move forward with having your placket, getting your placket installed. Couple of things. First of all, the placket that we've been discussing, the placket that you're going to do here, it's what's called a continuous lap placket. Those words are important.
Continuous lap?
Lap placket. What does continuous refer to?
Going on and on and on and on.
Exactly. What, in this particular instance, Connie's exactly right. What it means is that it's an individual piece, that it's not multiple pieces. One of the things we looked at on Friday, for example, plackets with zippers and jeans, can be multiple pieces. For this, it's a continuous lap placket. You will see that in the long run, you can do a placket out of a whole bunch of different pieces. You're learning how to do the continuous one. What does the fact that it's a lap placket mean? That one I'm hoping you know based on what we discussed on Friday.
Overlap, underlap?
Say it again louder.
Overlap, underlap?
Overlap, underlap. That's
Oh.
exactly what it is. That it contains the overlap, underlap. That it doesn't butt. So those words are important because you could have a continuous non-lapping placket. You could have a non-continuous non-lapping placket. You can have a whole series of different variations on that theme. In order to assemble and install your placket, you're going to need two things. To begin with, we're going to pretend that this is your shirt front. And for all of you, before you do any of this on the actual shirt, you're going to do it at least once in muslin, if not multiple times. In a minute, you'll see why it's so important that you do several samples first before you're ready to go. In order to start the process, the first thing you need is your placket marking. Your placket marking should be someplace over here. As we discussed on Friday, it's a straight line that's parallel to center front, so it's going to be on the straight grain. We discussed that it was going to come down to the bust point. On my body, that's roughly 10 inches. So I'm going to go ahead and mark this as if it were my shirt front. I'm going to have a neckline seam allowance up here. Then I'm going to come down my 10 inches and give myself a cross notch. So it's going to look something like that, right? One of the things that is weird about what I'm doing and what you guys are going to do is you actually have some sort of curve coming through here, which actually changes this shaping up here because you're coming into your neckline, right? That's why you would have a curve.
Yeah.
This 10 inches plus seam allowance starts to become important. Why? So that we know how long of a placket piece we actually need. For your purposes, your placket should be twice this length plus seam allowance. So I said it was 10, plus it has seam allowance, so it's an inch, so it's 11. So it needs to be 22 inches long plus seam allowance. So let's call it 24 to be safe. And again, in a minute, I'll explain why, a little more specifically where that 24 came from. For this placket, we wanted to finish at an inch wide. Because we've got an overlap and an underlap, i.e. a facing and a fashion layer, plus seam allowance, that means that it wants to be 3 inches wide to be able to finish at 1 inch wide. So we need a rectangle that's 3 inches wide, which I've already chopped, by 24 inches long. So let me go ahead and make this be 24 inches. There's a notch for halfway, which will become important later. And there's my full 24 inches. So that I can go ahead and draw in this edge and cut it off. Sometimes you want interfacing in your placket. Let's take a minute and talk about interfacing. What is it and why do we use it? Go.
Interfacing is refers to a various realm of materials you can put in your placket to add structure and make it stiffer or not.
Exactly. Interfacing is just another layer of fabric that goes inside to be able to add structure. You've noticed that sometimes sometimes we take advantage of fusible interfacing, so that we actually glue it in place first with the glue that's included in the interfacing, but not all interfacings are fusible, and you don't necessarily always want stuff to be fusible. Interfacings can be anything. If you go into a fabric store, they're gonna have a whole section of interfacing. And if you were, I mean, none of us are wearing collared things. You might, I don't even think the waistband on my jeans has interfacing in it. Various types of interfacing go inside of various different things. The thing that's important to remember is interfacing is nothing more than fabric. And so what happens if you don't have something that's quote unquote interfacing? For the first 10 years of my life, I just used self-fabric interfacing, just another layer, which historically is probably what they would have done, you know, if you're making a skirt on the prairie, you know, for Laura Ingalls Wilder. So it's, the thing that's important to remember about interfacing is it's just another fabric. And ultimately the goal is, by stacking the layers of fabric together, you're creating whatever variable you're looking for. If it's supposed to be a very, very stiff shirt on a collar, then that's going to determine the kind of interfacing I'm putting in. If it's just supposed to be some basic support for buttonholes on the front of a vest, where we're not actually trying to add any bulk, then that's going to indicate a different type of fabric that's going to be used for interfacing. Once you have your rectangle cut, first thing I want you to do is determine the right side and the wrong side. Since this already has a pencil line drawn on it, I'm going to call this the wrong side, and I'm writing a lovely little W there to be able to know that it's the wrong side. I'm going to take my placket, and along one of the two long edges, doesn't matter which one, whether it's this one or this one, I'm going to draw in a line that's a ½ inch in from the cut edge. When I determined that this needed to be 3 inches wide, it was so that there would be an inch here, an inch underneath, and then how much does that leave me for seam allowance to be able to sew both those edges? A total of 1 inch, right? So that tells me that that means I have a ½ inch on this edge and a ½ inch on that edge. Notice, I've only marked it on one of the two long edges. I haven't marked it on both of them. That'll become important in a minute. Actually, it's going to become important right now, because now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take it and turn it so that it's right side up. And again, I'm going to go ahead and just write an R on there, just for purposes of distinction, like to be able to see the difference between the two. On the right side, I've drawn my ½ inch line along this edge, so I want to go to the other edge. I'm going to do this in pencil, but you want to do this in disappearing marker when it comes time to do your real thing. And I'm going to mark that second ½ inch seam allowance line. When you go to do samples, it can be in pencil if you want, or it can be disappearing marker, whichever you prefer. But what's ultimately important is that for the final product, it's in disappearing marker. Why? Because it's on the right side of the garment. So we want that line there. And I'm trying to avoid drawing it in on the wrong side and having to thread mark it or something, because I need the marking on the right side of the garment. Now both pieces are ready to go. Catherine asked an interesting question in class on Friday about the installation of the placket. Do you remember what it was? We were talking about, okay, you need to cut your pieces and then you need to have your neckline and your hemline stay stitched. And Catherine asked, should the placket line be stay stitched? The truth of the matter is it should, but let's talk specifically about how. We know, because this is being inserted into the middle of a piece, that it's not on a seam line, that means we're gonna have to cut right up the fabric, right? Because we're gonna cut right up the fabric, we wanna make sure that the whole thing is stay stitched first so it doesn't fall apart. So I'm gonna walk over here to Sonic. You can either stay or follow, it doesn't really matter to me. And I'm gonna go ahead and put in a line of stay stitch. I'm purposefully using Sonic at the moment because he's in contrast thread. And so for the purposes of your samples, I actually encourage you, at least to begin with, to work in contrast thread so that you can actually see the various lines of sewing to make sure that you're being accurate. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stay stitch down one side of my marked placket, so that just that pencil line that's marked on the fabric. I'm going to pivot at the bottom and turn around and then go back up the other side. I want to make sure that I'm I want to make sure that I'm 1/8 of an inch outside of my pencil line. So my stay stitch line is actually quite close. And I'm starting up here at the cut edge. It's a stay stitch line, so I don't need to do any kind of back stitch. I just carefully stay stitch down the one side. One of the things that's important with my stay stitch, what's my stitch length set at?
5.
3.
Oh no.
3. What's 5 for?
Gathering.
3 is crucial here. And the truth is, if you wanted to, you could even go smaller. All right, Kristen, come in close
Okay.
as we get to the apex. Because you can see I maintain that 1/8 of an inch as I get to the apex. And then when I'm about two stitches away, I lift my foot and I pivot, so that I'm cutting over exactly to the point where the notch crosses the center line. Then I pivot back up on the same angle, and then go back up the other side.
Wow, that's super fancy.
Very, very fancy,
That
isn't
was
it?
really fancy. So you're just doing this right along each side of that line that you drew.
Correct. I'm about 1/8 of an inch on either side, so ultimately there's about 1/4 inch in between the two lines of sides of the stay stitching. Mine might even be less than 1/8 of an inch. The smaller the better, but we do want to make sure that we're not so small that we're not holding any fabric, and I'll explain what that means in a minute. Now that I've got it stay stitched, and again I want to be really clear, take a look, it's not an actual rectangle. It's almost like the shape of a very long needle, where it comes straight down and then it angles over and angles back out, so it has that point at the bottom. My accuracy here is not great. It'll be fine for the purposes of my demonstration, but that point really should come exactly to where those two things cross. And so, taking it out of the machine, I would probably want to go back, pop a couple of those stitches, and just redo that point.
Because it's extending beyond the line?
Because it's not exactly at the point where the notch crosses the center line, the placement line. Before I go any further, I'm going to go ahead and press